afternoon and welcome to our event this afternoon. A special event, harm reduction after lockdown, live stream update for all of you who have tuned in. Thank you for tuning in this afternoon. Wominjeka, my name is Nick and I'm broadcasting to you this evening from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd also like to recognise that we benefit from the knowledge and insights of First Nations people, including their long relationship with plants and the understanding of their many uses. I'd like to pay respect to elders past, present and any young people present today. So, as I said, today's webcast is focused on getting us back out to events, to festivals, to venues and to fields all across Victoria after 6 lockdowns, 262 days in lockdown in total, and just finding our feet once more. From punter to performer to service provider, we're all dusting off cobwebs. We're all going to be readying ourselves for some knowns and some unknowns. Among those unknowns are how people are going to take to partying after such a long time in lockdown, because we know that people's lockdown experience has been quite varied. Some people have really taken to the solitude of lockdown and other people have not at all enjoyed it. But we are all going to be joining again at events and festivals. To just take us through a little bit of what to expect, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Bridget Hayes, the DanceWize coordinator. B, what are we expecting for our 21-22 season after 262 days in lockdown?
Thanks, Nick. So I guess it's going to be quite an interesting season coming up. We're not exactly sure what's going to happen because we've never had Downs previously and have had such a gap in the festival seasons like this. So it is going to be interesting and full of unknowns. I guess things to look out for and be mindful of, and things that we're going to be discussing today are that people are just out of shape and out of whack of going to festivals, both as patrons but also as crew. Also due to the nature of lockdowns, specifically in Victoria, I think that's really impacted on the gig economy. And so a lot of people that work in the festival scene, so people that work like as roadies, as technicians, as like various crew in management, performing artists, a lot of these people have moved on from the industry, and so a lot of that expertise and experience may have gone with them. So we may see a rise in newer or more naive patrons, but also crew members. So that's, I guess, something to be aware of. And I guess the long-term implications of lockdowns and how that may result on people's mental health and perhaps people's alcohol and other drug experiences too.
Thank you, B. I'd like to introduce now Ryan Czawrno. Ryan is the Director of Public Events, Department of Human Services. And Ryan, I might just cross to you to give a quick introduction of your role and what you get up to. just me, not Ryan. You can't see.
Sorry, Ryan.
Thank you. That's a good overview. And I suppose one of the other things that we've got to consider, and probably your team are considering, is that the biggest thing during this whole pandemic has been the strain on our public health resources. And we're still going to be looking at that strain continuing into the future as we learn to live with COVID. What challenges does that provide to us having bigger events and festivals, which also can provide put a strain on our services? Thank you, Ryan. The next person I would like to introduce on our panel this afternoon is Julia Robinson, Chair of the Australian Festivals Association. Julia, welcome, and can you talk to us a little bit about your role before we get into the nitty-gritty? Fantastic. And you have been running through recently some risk assessment following this almost 2 years of lockdown. What sorts of things can you tell us about that process so far? And part of this process of working on festivals going forward has been you've been developing a bit of a training package with the Australian Festivals Association. It hasn't quite launched yet, but can you tell us a little bit about what we can expect from that and maybe when it's going to be launched? And of course, the requirements are different across every state and territory in Australia, so we won't go into the specifics of every state and territory, other than if you are in that state, you'll know what your requirements are. We know that in New South Wales there are slightly different requirements than there are here in Victoria, where we're broadcasting from. We have a bit of a special treat for you as well. We've got a musician here in the Harm Reduction Victoria boardroom, where I'm broadcasting from. RP Downey is our musician who you're hearing from a little bit in the background. We're going to take a short break and hear from RP Downey, robertdowney.com, and I'll drop that in the YouTube chat as well. Thanks for joining us here, and stick around, and we'll be talking more on harm reduction after lockdown.
We can't hear the other speakers on Zoom. Apparently it's not coming through the YouTube channel. We can hear it on the Zoom,
Right.
but it's not coming through the YouTube channel.
Right. And we can't see them either, because I thought you were going to be putting the links.
They're all coming through fine.
No, I mean on YouTube, like putting it through to the through the Black Magic.
Well, I can see we can check here to see what they're coming through on the YouTube channel. But can I just get him his screen sort of first? Can we just
Oh, they can't. harm reduction after lockdown, a live stream update for you. And we understand, watching on the YouTube, that maybe you haven't been hearing from our panelists. We are taking a recording of today's event, and I'm just looking for a thumbs up. Yep, we have a recording of today's event, so if you are missing anything, we'll make sure to send around that recording afterwards so that you'll be able to see everything in whole. So I'm going to continue and just hope that everything is working, and keep continuing speaking to my guests who are right here. And yeah, sorry if you can't hear. Hopefully we've sorted it out now though. So I'd like to introduce our next guest now, which is Jeff Moss from Sound Event Group. Jeff, could you give us a little introduction and talk to us about your role? Well, we can.
Yeah.
They still can't hear Jeff. Excellent, thank you for that, Jeff. And just quickly, what sorts of challenges do you yourself see just as we're moving out of lockdown and back into events? Some unique challenges that perhaps we haven't discussed yet. No, absolutely, especially since I'd say the arts and hospitality industry has been one of the hardest hit over our lockdowns and one of the slowest to be able to get back up after our lockdowns have been lifted. So we really need all the support that we can get, and we hope that that support continues throughout all the tiers, whether it's government, whether it's the popular and mainstream media. We hope to see support, because because that's what we need right now. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, and thank you very much, Jeff. Stick around because we've got a little bit more to go. Our next panelist, Professor John Fitzgerald. John does drug market research at the University of Melbourne. John, would you like to talk to us a little bit about what you get up to?
Yeah, look, thanks. I just wanted to say thanks to everyone. We were going to get Monica to speak to some of the trends in the impact of the lockdown on drug markets, but unfortunately Monica can't get here. She's quite ill today, so I'm sort of filling in for this. And we were going to look at some material that was coming out of some survey work coming out of NDARC that was presented earlier this year. But look, I might just speak briefly to that, to some of that work. I won't do the kind of researchy thing and do a PowerPoint, which would just be terrible. So I won't do that. I'll just speak briefly to it. But I think one of the key questions that I certainly would be interested in, and I'd really be interested in other people's perspective on this as well, would be, the key question would be, do you think people will be more inclined to use drugs and more drugs coming out of COVID-19 restrictions? Or not just more drugs, or more hazardously, because not just in terms of what they're interested in doing, but because of the circumstances that they're in. And what I thought I would do is that we recently did some work during the lockdown in Victoria where we monitored the drug market, and we were particularly interested in what happens to a drug market when the COVID-19 restrictions are put in place. And the premise was, when you actually restrict people's movement and the movement of the drug market, what happens to the drug market itself? And this was because we noticed when we were doing monitoring the drug market at a music festival in Melbourne in March of 2019, we noticed that there was just very little ketamine at this particular music event, and it was actually at the same time that the Wuhan lockdown was on, and we just thought it was an incredible coincidence that there was a lockdown going on in China and there was no ketamine at this festival. It's just an incredible coincidence. Anyway, we got us thinking that actually we should be monitoring the impact of lockdowns internationally. We should be looking at what happens, what impact that has on the drug market in Victoria, and that's what got us to monitoring the drug market in Victoria during the lockdown during 2020, which is what we did. Anyway, it got us thinking more broadly about actually just reviewing what was the impact of the lockdown. And generally, when I sort of sat down and looked at the review, this was the kind of general picture. And what it was that we noticed that there were small reductions in drug use of some substances, and that was mainly because there was less opportunity for social interaction. And that was based on a lot of survey work. There was also a reduced opportunity of drug market activity, so there was less movement of people, less movement of drugs. So that meant there was less drug market activity. There was an increase after lockdown at the end of 2020. There was a really marked increase in alcohol consumption and an increase in cannabis consumption, and that was reproduced not just in survey work, but also in the monitoring work that we did in wastewater analysis in Victoria, where we saw really big peaks, really big sharp increases in alcohol consumption and in other people's work in cannabis consumption as well. We also saw really sharp spikes in MDMA consumption and meth consumption that were seasonal. So end of the year, around Christmas time, we saw really big spikes in MDMA consumption around this time last year. What we also saw in Victoria in particular is that we saw the introduction of new drugs into the market, and we monitored in a number of different places around Melbourne the drug market in a couple of different ways, and we actually saw the introduction of some what they call synthetic opioids. So things like fentanyl and things like that, but we actually noticed that there was a new drug introduced into Victoria that we hadn't actually seen anywhere in the world before. And it was this thing called U10, beta-U10. It was a fentanyl-like drug, and it had never been introduced into a drug market into anywhere else in the world. We were the first ever, and it was introduced in September 2020. It lasted about 6 weeks, and it was introduced in North Richmond. And it lasted about 6 weeks when heroin became incredibly hard to get. And then when heroin came back on board at the end of October, then the U10 disappeared. It was a flash in the pan, and we were lucky that it was not a very powerful drug, but it was a really good example of what happens when drugs become scarce, that new drugs get introduced into the market. And so these are the sort of dynamics that we anticipate in drug markets when lockdown conditions get introduced, that you get changes like this. And so this is the kind of, you get substitutions, you get combinations, you get people mixing and matching, and you get dealers introducing things that they haven't introduced before. So these are the sort of things that we anticipate.
That's really interesting on that point about substitution, and maybe like a little bit of an expansion on that, because some people might be hearing that and thinking, oh my gosh, there's completely new drugs being introduced in Melbourne, and especially for some they might recognise North Richmond as being a bit of a trigger point with other services being provided in North Richmond, and worrying there that's the cause of it. So maybe can we talk a little bit more about substitution and about the fact that you are preparing for these things, because I think it does go to show as well that prohibition doesn't stop supply from happening, because there are always other things out there, and people will just look for something else, something similar, something completely, as long as they can get change their state of mind.
Yeah, and look, and the main thing is that with the main message is that the drug market is very adaptive, and what happened as soon as heroin became more available, that drug disappeared. And that particular drug is not particularly dangerous in the sense that there wasn't an increase in overdoses, there wasn't an increase in harm at the time when it was introduced in Victoria, and so we shouldn't get overly worried about that particular appearance of that particular drug. We haven't seen it, we've only seen it appear in Queensland and in WA in short bursts. So these are very small indications about what happens when restrictions are placed on drug markets. But there are other things actually that now that we're actually lifting restrictions, there are other things that we really should be looking at that are really important for this summer. And I think I've got a list here. So when we ask the question, what are the conditions that are going to impact on whether people are going to change their pattern of use around this summer festival? I've got questions like, well, are they going to be able to spend? What's their access to income going to be like? Well, during lockdown, we had government actually subsidising them. Well, those subsidies no longer are going to be there. So, are they going to have a lot more disposable income? Well, that's not going to be the case. Are they going to have access to drugs? Well, we actually don't know whether the supply to actually drugs is back on. We know that the supply to methamphetamine was actually very low during lockdown. That it was quite difficult to get methamphetamine in many parts of Australia. So we don't actually know whether access is going to be easy in many parts of Australia. Do we know whether people are going to be able to get their drug of choice? Whether people are going to be interested in the same substances that they usually would be? The surveys are not clear on that. Do we know about the changes in purity and price? Well, some of the survey work that's being done in Victoria would suggest that the prices for some drugs actually went up as a result of lockdown, and the purity went down. So these are things that would suggest that it's going to actually not be easier for people to use a lot more drugs. The mode of delivery, is it going to be easier for people to get access because the delivery mechanisms are easier? Well, that's not necessarily the case. We're not sure about that. We just don't know. And finally, what about the policing? Police are in the mix. We don't know how important they are in terms of, what impact they have on people's access to drugs. But in some contexts they are important, some others they're not. So we're not quite sure about that as well. There are a lot of unknowns, and so I'd be really throwing it back to the panel about, within the context of festivals, within the context of this summer coming up, what do they think? What do they think? So I'm sorry, I haven't got very many good answers, but this is the best we've got at the moment. What does the panel think about, what does their gut say to them about some of these questions about what can we anticipate about the use of illegal drugs this summer?
Is there any panellists who would like to comment? Yep, absolutely. Julia, did you want to add something? It's good to mention, you mentioned cocaine there as well, because one of the things that we did see over the past 18 months was Melbourne overtaking Sydney in cocaine being its popular drug, and just anecdotally as well, we've heard that cocaine has become a much more popular drug over the past few years, and with it comes its own set of risks, which, as you sort of alluded to there, Julia, are often missed by even people who are a little bit older, who just don't realise the risks of this drug. And this goes back to, looking back at the way that our drug education happens or doesn't really happen in schools. There's a whole systemic issue here with our drug education, but that's a broader issue. We want to talk a little bit about communicating on drug issues that are out there, and how to communicate with punters, and we're going to talk about that in just a tick. This is Harm Reduction After Lockdown, a live stream update, and we're going to be hearing a little bit more from RP Downey, who you are hearing from in the background at the moment. robertdowney.com. I'll drop that link in the chat if you want to find out more about what he does. Thank you. sticking with us. A reminder that we are taking a recording of today's event where you'll be able to hear and see everything that's going on that has been perhaps a little bit ghostly to you on the YouTube live stream, but not to us in our Zoom call. And I guarantee you we have been having a fantastic discussion. You'll just have to stay tuned for that recording to be made available. We are talking harm reduction after lockdown with our guests, Professor John Fitzgerald, Ryan Czawrno from the Department of Health, Julia Robinson from Australian Festivals Association, Bridget Hayes, the coordinator of the DanceWize program, RP Downey has been doing our music. Jeff Moss is from the Sound Event Group, and I'd like to introduce our final panelist this afternoon, Isobel Volpe, Research Fellow at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Isobel, you're involved with a little bit of research around communicating about drug issues. Can you talk to us, introduce yourself and talk to us a little bit about the sort of work you've been doing? And one of the things that's really important before we get to a point where we need to be alerted is that people need to know about the substances that they might be taking in the first place, and that's where DanceWize here in Victoria, that has 25 years of experience in New South Wales, going on nearly 5 years of experience, have really specialised in developing and disseminating resources. And I might ask B to talk us through some of the resources here that I have, colourful resources in front of us, newly redesigned, and this is really the first port of call. We don't want you to, an alert to be the first port of call where you're alarmed about a substance. We want you to come at this before you decide to even take a substance and learn about these different substances so that you're armed with knowledge, because knowledge is the key to harm reduction. That's what we want first and foremost. B.
Yeah, sure. So at every festival that we attend and other events such as going to schools and things like that, we'll have our substance specific brochures on all different types of substances that may be used, usually within festivals or party settings. Some other substances as well that may not be as traditionally used in these kind of environments, but are still things that people may be using. So you've got things like LSD, benzodiazepines, we've got ice, MDMA, and so we'll have information all about like the long and short term effects. We've got things like the half-life and also some harm reduction tips for using these specific substances as well. Coming out of our gender-based violence service, we've also got a few different resources. We've got the Just Say No. This is one of our resources about checking substances before using it, and our grounding information as well, which is quite relevant, especially coming out of lockdown, when people may be experiencing more mental health issues or just a bit more fragile than when they were, I guess, interacting in the festival space a lot more regularly than they have been recently.
We have videos to support those images that B was just holding up on our DanceWize YouTube channel. So please do subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already, and go and have a look at those after our live stream is finished. But John, maybe I just want to cross back to you talking about last year's results. We talked a little bit about the drug consumption data before the break, but did you want to talk to us a little bit more about last year's results? You sort of, I mean, you covered most of it pretty well, and we were, I've just got you here to talk again.
Thanks, Brett.
About this.
Sorry. Look, we actually didn't talk about the festival results. What we did at festivals was we did some slightly different work at festivals. What we did was I was working with Gavin Reid, who was working at Bio21 at Melbourne Uni, and we got some pilot funding to develop up a technique where we collected up the plastic Ziploc bags, and we at events we would collect up to 500 of these little plastic bags, and during the course of the event we would collect them, and we would collect up the residue inside the bag and with a little cotton wool bud, and we would wipe the inside of the bag with a cotton wool bud, and we could actually use even what was not visible, the residue that was not visible, you could actually put it inside the really sensitive equipment that Gavin's got, and we could test the residue for the presence of whatever substance was in that plastic bag. And over the course of the night, we could give updates every 2 hours to the event management, and which would then let them know what was being consumed over the course of the night. We did this, we only did it at events where the management wanted us to do that, and again, we integrated with the event management team, and it gave us the opportunity to provide a kind of early warning system for the event. If we came across, we gave updates on what was being consumed at the event, and we relied on the branding on the bags. So if the bags were branded Superman bags or Green Aliens or whatever the bags were, that it gave us an opportunity that if there was something that was particularly nasty in the bag, that if the bag was branded, then we could actually give a warning about the bag. So that's the best we could do in the current conditions. It was the closest thing we could do to pill testing in Victoria at the time. We did do occasionally, if there was an opportunity where we came across an intact pill or an intact substance, then we could test that. And we did do that on occasions, and where at Beyond the Valley we gave out a warning in 2019-20 for a UPS pill which contained N-ethylpentalone. And if people were at that event, they would have gotten a warning at that event over the local socials at the event, and that was us. We did the testing on that particular tablet, and that contained N-ethylpentalone, which was a particularly nasty substance that has been responsible for a lot of overdoses, and that was our testing that was done at that event. So we did a lot of testing over, I think it was, I can't remember how many events we did testing at, but eventually we got to the point where we were able to put the really sensitive equipment in the back of a University of Melbourne van, and we were able to put that van at the event, and we were able to do that at an event in Flemington in March of 2020. So we were able to basically do on-site testing, and I think the equivalent of what they talk about that is kind of basically population-based testing. So we weren't doing it for the individual, we were doing it for the population of people at the event. And so that's what we did. And that gave us the potential to actually give feedback to the event management about what was being consumed and if there was any particularly nasty things.
And as I said before, knowledge is the key to harm reduction. The more information that we have, the easier it is that we can reduce those harms by providing information on what would happen if you consumed that substance, or saying, hey, that's probably not a substance that you would want to be consuming in the first place, especially if you think that X is Y, and that's not what you want to be taking. Just want to say a big congratulations right now as well to our friends, colleagues, brothers, sisters, cousins, etc. across the ocean there in New Zealand who have just legalised pill testing. They will now have services, drug checking services operating legally at festivals, pop-up clinics, university, orientation and other locations from this summer and beyond. And they always seem to be just a little step ahead of us on a lot of these things. So congratulations, New Zealand. As Isobel mentioned, there are a few services here in Australia, like The Loop. There's also Pill Testing Australia, who have run 2 successful trials in Canberra at Groove in the Moo, and there are plenty of people who want to see these sorts of services available. As John has touched on, there are many different ways to do this as well, from a behind-the-scenes focus to a more front-facing consumer focus. That is a much broader discussion that unfortunately we don't have the time to delve into today because we are nearly at our hour. But before we finish up this afternoon, I just want to cross back to each of our panelists and give you each an opportunity to perhaps express your wishes for this season, maybe some, since we have had 2 years of a lot of public health policy focus in other areas, what are maybe some of your wishes for public health policy going forward in relation to festivals and events? Ryan, first. Thank you, Ryan. Jeff. Thank you, Jeff. Julia. Thank you, Julia and Isobel. B.
Yep. I guess just sort of touching on what other people have said, and just really highlighting, I guess, the need for specific harm reduction services within festival spaces and other events. Just having, I guess, practical things in place, such as having chill out spaces and care spaces, having more access to water throughout the festival and campsites, having additional roving crowd care services, and trying to implement trauma counsellors at as many events as possible. Just trying to get all these practical aspects that would just make our festival safer and honestly just a more enjoyable party if everyone's having a good time and not going into distressing situations.
Thank you, B. And finally, John.
Yeah, as the dad of a new graduate from high school this year, I'm particularly interested to try and make them as safe as they possibly can. I think Jeff said to me some time ago that the most important thing is to make it make it a really patron focused experience. And as much of each of us really want our thing to be the most important thing, I think at the end of the day it's their thing, and I think that's the most important. Is whether it's substances, whether it's the performer, whether it's the sound, whether it's whatever it is, it's actually their experience, and it's our job to make that experience a great experience and not the last one. And I think that's the thing that I take home with me every time. And I think that to me is the thing I really hold dear. And I think if we can make that the focus, then I think we're doing well.
Thank you, John, and I'd like to again thank all of our panelists who have, I guarantee, been with us here this afternoon. First of all, Professor John Fitzgerald, who's sitting right next to me, Ryan Czawrno, who is from the Department of Health, Julia Robertson from the Australian Festivals Association, Bridget Hayes from DanceWize here in Victoria, Isobel Volpe, who is from RMIT and working on drug research there, Jeff Moss from the Sound Event Group, and also our musician, RP Downey, who you've been hearing from in the background. Thank you for sticking with us on this live stream. Like I said, for those 5 of you who are still watching, we have a recording and we will put that out so you can hear everything that we have been discussing later. And I'd like to thank as well, special thanks to John, who has put this together, and Ned as well, who is behind the buttons and has been looking after things. So thank you, everyone. This has been Harm Reduction After Lockdown, a live stream update, and we hope to do more things in the future. Certainly a learning experience for us, and we hope to bring more information in a much more coherent way for the future. Thank you. Bye-bye.